Thank you so much. A very warm welcome and a very good afternoon for this post-lunch session. It's a special session as we talk about on trade talks and unlocking a deglobalized world. There has been a lot of talk about deglobalization, or more accurately, slowing down of globalization. Globalization, as it is now often described, is actually slowly turning its tide towards deglobalization. This has been accelerated over the last couple of years, particularly because of the supply disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical events like the Russia-Ukraine war, and also concerns in domestic economies, particularly the US, because of fears of job loss due to low-wage competitors. But what the facts actually are, what are the facts, and exactly what are driving these? To talk about all of these and much more, we have a stellar panel of experts who know what's happening on the high seas of global trade, commerce, technology, and geostrategy like the back of their palms. It is my privilege to welcome Abhijit Das, former head, Center of WTO Studies, IIFT. Richard McCallum, CEO, UKIBC. Somnath Mukherjee, Managing Partner and CIO, ASK Advisors. And Jason Oxman, CEO and President, ITI Council. A very warm welcome, gentlemen. And we are meeting at a time when, just a couple of days before the G20 meeting actually gets going here in India. And trade, obviously, we know is the engine of global growth. But we are talking about something that is actually turning the clock in the opposite direction, which is deglobalization. Abhijit, just first to you. What's your view about deglobalization as it stands in the current, in the current days and in the current years? Is it actually turning the clock back? Because what it does, if deglobalization rapidly gathers pace, it carries the risk of negating all gains from international trade.
At the outset, I'm grateful to Moneycontrol and other organizers for organizing this event and inviting me to share some thoughts. Thank you, Gaurav, for the question. Now, what we are seeing today is not something very new. Those of us who have a bit of a longer memory about globalization, I would take you back to 1980s. Some of the churning, some of the storms that we are seeing, we've been there before. 1980s was a time when Japan was slowly ascending, United States felt threatened, and then there were talks about deglobalization during those days as well. And what we are seeing today is almost a repeat of history. This, to my mind, is a temporary phase. Once the equations between United States and China come to some sort of an equilibrium, when that will happen, that's an open question. But once we reach some sort of an equilibrium, the storms that we are seeing today are likely to abate.
Well, we'll all hope so, that it's likely to abate very sooner rather than later. But Richard, a question to you, a lot of, inter-country cooperation, particularly in the context of global trade, is a complex space. It's akin to the hour hand of a clock where you rarely see moving. And it's also about protecting domestic interests. Where do you see, how do you situate the rising tide towards deglobalization when there's also a lot of emphasis on striking bilateral and multilateral trade deals?
Thank you, Gaurav. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure. Obviously, business today has to operate within a context of increased global neo-mercantilism, protectionism. And you can understand the context there because of the disruption from COVID, the disruption to supply chains, the precarious geopolitical context which threatens to significantly disrupt trade. But at the same time, I think it is not incompatible that you can have domestic GDP growth with more focus on self-reliance. So, for example, I do a lot of work in the defense sector, and in the defense sector, obviously, India has restricted the import of a number of capability areas in order to build up its domestic manufacturing. And actually, UK business understands that and is supportive of it because we have technology which can help domestic manufacturing to grow. So I think it's important to look at it in that context and not, to look at this as, particularly from my perspective, UK-India, as a strategic partnership, not just what you put in boxes and ship across the sea.
Abhijit, the question here is about the rising dominance, and that's a lingering question that dominates global trade discussions, is also about the dominance that the dollar wields on global trade. And over the last couple of years, particularly over the last decade or so, we have seen that there's a slow but sure, there's a sure move towards de-dollarization. Just take the case of India, for instance. 86% of our imports are invoiced in dollars. We import 16% from China. All of that is invoiced in dollars. Obviously, international of the rupee is something that the government and the RBI has laid a lot of emphasis on. But do you think de-dollarization is something that the world can achieve, with the US contributing about 25% of the GDP?
Yeah, thanks, Saurav. First of all, the name Somnath, not Abhijit. But thanks for inviting me over. About the dollar and the de-dollarization conversation, and that's got fresh boost post the expansion of BRICS yesterday. I think a lot of it is just sound and fury and very little light. There is no alternative to the dollar, as we know. Dollar remains the primary currency for trade, finance, and global transactions, and in the foreseeable future will remain the primary currency. And the reason for that is not US Navy. The reason for that is not the fact that the Saudis decided to invoice their oil in dollars, and famously known as petrodollars. The reason for that is that the United States is not only the largest economy in the world by a very long mile, 25% of GDP as you mentioned, it is also the largest financial system by a much bigger mile, and runs a monetary policy that gives up significant amounts of central bank monetary policy freedom that no other central bank will even dare to give up. So till that architecture is in place, de-dollarization will sound good in conferences like these and some other conferences with political undertones as well. But in brass tacks terms, it's a no-show.
But don't you think that India, through bilateral deals, we have recently seen in July, Bangladesh and India have started trading in the Bangladeshi taka and the Indian rupee. India has already struck a deal with the UAE, the RBI and the Central Bank of the UAE. That's probably an addendum to the India-UAE SEPA. Many such deals are in the works. One with Indonesia, we know that in the recent meeting, in the G20 meeting in Gandhinagar, that came up very, very strongly. Do you think that is a way out to actually lower the dependence on dollars, Somnath?
Interesting you brought up the example of the India-UAE trade, which is the most recent one to be invoiced in rupees. Now the UAE dirham is pegged. Guess what it's pegged with? It's pegged with the dollar. So essentially, barring the optics and some very minor, to be honest, transaction costs, which also I am extremely, as a banker, skeptical about in terms of any reduction of transaction cost, it actually does zilch to the dominance or the preeminence of US dollar as a currency for intermediation. It remains the US dollar. You call it something else, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's likely to be a duck.
That's right. Jason, what's your view about India's arrived on the global table of high technology. UPI probably is going to go down in history as India's biggest fintech exports. Do you think India's time as a potential source for technology exports has come?
India is now. The time for India is now. What an exciting time to be an Indian and an exciting time to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. the digitization story of India is nothing short of miraculous. The way in which the Modi administration has focused on bringing hundreds of millions of Indian citizens onto the digital economy is going to power India toward that goal of being a $1 trillion economy and being the third largest economy in the world. India this year became not only the largest democracy in the world, but the largest country in the world. So the opportunity here is absolutely limitless. And the way in which the administration is focused on technology and innovation, not only in digitization of the economy, but also in focusing on physical manufacturing of goods, will also help power the digital economy. You mentioned DPI and the UPI protocol that has given hundreds of millions of Indian citizens access to financial services who never had it before. What a great way to lift people up by giving them access to banking and lending capabilities, allowing them to develop small businesses, become entrepreneurs. That is enormously important. I think that connectivity will have spillover benefits in other areas as well. Education, workforce development, access to healthcare. So this is certainly a moment in time where India's focus on technology and innovation will bring that economy ever closer to that $1 trillion goal. And we also see, particularly during the B20 and the G20, a focus on India's partners around the world in that effort. Supply chains, as you mentioned in your opening remark, are global, and they're also fragile. So we need to make sure that we develop robust and secure supply chains across nations that are like-minded in their focus, and ensure that those supply chains are resilient enough to withstand the next global pandemic, whatever form it takes. And then finally, I think the thing that's so exciting about India's efforts here is the effort to export the lessons learned and the technologies developed here. The Prime Minister has talked a lot about how he wants a vision for DPI and UPI to be exported around the world and to give other countries and other companies the opportunity to participate in that global economic development that digitization makes possible. That's exciting too.
Absolutely. Abhijit, you know, India has set a very ambitious merchandise export target, which will probably, you're looking at trebling that from the current levels by the end of this decade, 2030. But the road to that target will have to go through the hinterland. Do you think we have the right, the policies in place, the right conditions in place to create new slivers of manufacturing hubs much beyond the glitzy metros?
Gaurav, I'm delighted that you hit the nail on the head. The road to expanding or reaching our very ambitious export target is actually through the hinterland. And at this juncture, what really constrains our export efforts are the infrastructural deficiencies, logistics costs, so on and so forth, which really make our exports not very competitive in the global market, which prevent the lead firms in global supply chains from linking with Indian vendors. The government is very cognizant of these constraints, and some of the initiatives aimed at enhancing the domestic infrastructure, particularly in the hinterland, have already started showing results. And it's a matter of time, when I say matter of time, maybe next 4 or 5 years, when we will see many of these ambitious infrastructure projects coming to fruition. And that will be the time when we will see Indian exports really surge. And to my mind, the surge which we will see at that juncture will be much more than what we might see through market access that we might get through our free trade agreement negotiations.
Absolutely. Richard, to that point, actually, we are negotiating a lot of free trade agreements with several countries. One of them, obviously, is with the UK. Is there a possibility, and since you represent industries from both the sides, both the countries, is there a possibility that we are looking at a Diwali signing of the India-UK FTA?
Thank you for the question. Look, when the 5th and 6th largest economies in the world do a trade deal, it's important to get that deal right. So I know that everyone is working very hard on the deal. I know there's a lot of political will behind the deal. Our members are Cautiously hopeful that we will get there. I think there is a landing point. I don't know when it is. Sensibly, no one's making any arbitrary comments on timing on this. But our members certainly want to see it happen. And I think, irrespective of the important content of this deal, it's the start of something for us. It's the start of a process, not the culmination of a process. It's the start of a renewed UK-India relationship and something to build on.
That's right. Somnath, I come back to you again on the question of, on currency. And every time there's a volatility in the dollar, we end up importing inflation. It knocks up prices here. It knocks up the prices of petrol and diesel. If the landed volume of petrol or crude oil exports have gone up by 9%, the landed cost has gone up by 21% last year compared to the previous year. And that's primarily because of the dollar volatility. How do we get around this?
I don't think we need to be terribly concerned about currency volatility. That's part of the game. And if you see over longer periods of time, 4, 5, 6 years, the theoretical interest parity principle works pretty much okay. The depreciation in the Indian currency is roughly similar to the difference in inflation between the US and India. Something that most commercial organizations, financial institutions are fairly used to, and there are very, very well developed tools to hedge against that. So it's not something that we need to be terribly bothered about. RBI does a fantastic job in terms of managing macro stability. So what is required is preservation of macro stability and ensuring that the currency reaches its true value without very sharp spikes in volatility. And that's something that RBI does a fantastic job of. We don't need to be overly bothered about depreciation of the rupee. That's natural. That will happen, and there's nothing that we can either do or be worried about in that context. Just one point on free trade that you mentioned. I think the reason why we see such a recalcitrance amongst Indian negotiators to conclude free trade agreements is twofold. One, the previous FTAs have all been largely import positive for India, which is we've ended up importing a lot more than we've managed to export. So market access has worked one way. And second, and that's the fundamental problem, most of the FTAs, especially with the developed world, the Western world, are about market access to India. So they are okay to exploit the comparative advantage of capital that they have, but they are unwilling to give us the comparative advantage of labor that we have. So labor access is not in the question or on the table, and hence we are also rather recalcitrant in concluding these FTAs. And I think it's okay. I don't think we need to be overly bothered on how many FTAs we sign. There are many other things to be done, and those probably have a lot bigger bang for the buck.
Jason, we are having this discussion about de-globalization. Essentially, countries are probably protecting their own turfs because of, as we said, supply chain disruptions that has been caused by exogenous factors like the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war, and also various other factors at play. But the same causes also actually reinforces the argument for more collaboration, for more globalization. How do we reconcile both the sides?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, global supply chains are behind all of the solutions to the questions you raise, which are all very important questions. And I think the approach that government of India is taking is the right approach, and it has a number of prongs to it that I think are underway but making very good progress. So let's talk, for example, about the PLI program, which is very focused on ensuring manufacturing takes place here in India. It's a program that's been very successful in the mobile phone marketplace, where Apple is now making iPhones for the India market here in India. Samsung is making mobile devices here in India. Now we look to expand that into broader categories like manufacturing of laptops and PCs and servers. We also look to expand it into semiconductor manufacturing programs to advance construction of fabs here in India. So the physical manufacturing taking place here in India, while recognizing that supply chains are global, will, I think, help address these concerns that may arise again. I think a second area is looking very closely at digitization and data flows. The recently concluded data protection law, just enacted and into effect last week, is a remarkable achievement by the government of India because it includes the free flow of data across borders, allowing establishment of data centers and data facilities and businesses to grow their international data businesses here in India. So on both the digital side and the physical side, if you will, of technology innovation, programs are helping to develop that economy here in India in a way that establishes secure supply chains. And to this point about reluctance to enter into free trade agreements, which I would say is certainly the case in the United States as well right now, the current administration having concluded exactly 0 free trade agreements, it is important to look to other programs and other opportunities and other frameworks to ensure multilateral arrangements that allow economic development whilst also taking advantage of opportunities for reaching global markets.
You know, Abhijit, there was this point raised that about movement of labor has not been as efficient and effective as the movement of capital and products into it. So we ended up being net importers from the FTAs that we signed instead of being net exporters of talent and capital. That's part of Mode 4 of the WTO agreement. But my question is a lot broader one, is when you have bilateral deals or multilateral deals within regions and countries coming about, what role does it bring in for WTO? Because the WTO was supposed to be the global trading corp. Has it failed on that responsibility?
Very interesting question, Gaurav. WTO agreement itself has an inbuilt provision which allows countries to get into these bilateral free trade agreements. And this provision goes back to the good old GATT days. The perception was that free trade agreements or bilateral deals would be a stepping stone towards greater trade liberalization. So to that extent, there is really no contradiction between what these free trade agreements intend to do and what WTO envisages. The problem which really is now afflicting free trade agreements, Somnath alluded to some of those problems, is the fact that these free trade agreements are no longer exclusively about trade. They are about many more other aspects: labor, environment, gender, regulatory environment, etc., etc. And those, if we are not very careful, can have a very debilitating impact on our own development prospects. So, and the attempt which is really already underway is to negotiate provisions around these agreements in free trade agreements and thereafter inject it or transplant it into the WTO. To my mind, that will be a very, very problematic moment. And if that happens, then the development dimension of WTO will be almost obliterated.
But we have a situation where, you know, two of the world's biggest economies, the US and the China, fighting over various trade-related issues, and the WTO, despite being the global trade polis, standing as a mute spectator. Where does WTO stand in this kind of a situation?
The interesting thing is, at the WTO, with the exception of 1 or 2 issues, partly related to agriculture and partly related to state-owned enterprises, my perspective is that the interests of United States and China are amazingly aligned at the WTO. Neither of the two countries would like a collapse of this institution. This has served their economic interests very well. You're very correct that at this juncture, the appellate body of the WTO, which was something like an umpire between disputing countries, that has been rendered dysfunctional by the United States. But the objective there is to come to a world which is not rule-based but power-dominated. Yeah. And that is something which suits the United States at this juncture. But at some point in time, even China can take advantage of that. So that is a bit of an uncharted territory, no doubt. But at the end of the day, it suits neither China nor US to weaken the WTO.
That's right. Richard, you know, bilateral trade or inter-country trade and also trade agreements has a lot to do with, and it takes, the negotiations are protracted also because it's about protecting your domestic interests. For India, it is about giving access to its millions of artisans and craftsmen, access to the global market. But at the same time, we need to protect jobs too. We have had a situation when Air India's Airbus deal is creating millions of jobs, thousands of jobs in the UK. Now, in such a situation, when there are pulls and pressures from both sides, and India has become the 5th largest economy, but there are also significant social equity issues, economic equity issues that India has to resolve. When you have to protect domestic interests, or at the same time also give access to the global market to Indian artisans, how do you go about achieving this?
Thanks, Gaurav. So, obviously, countries are going to focus on the growth of their domestic economy and development of their domestic industries. I gave the example earlier of defense, where it's a natural progression. I think the important thing here is to look beyond, to think of trade as in a more holistic sense. So we think of it as, for example, collaboration opportunities between academia in the UK and industry in India. That's a win-win. It's still a form of collaboration and trade which benefits both sides, but it allows one side to help grow its domestic economy and the other side to benefit from something that it does very well. I have a good example of this. I was in Lucknow 2 weeks ago, and I went to a factory there, and they make titanium castings, and they use the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre in the UK, in Sheffield, to refine the process of their manufacture and improve the product. They then get shipped to the UK, where they find a place in engines and pumps, and then they're sold around the world. So I think this can be seen in a more collaborative sense than just sort of the question of protecting industry, and you see what I mean?
Absolutely. So, Somnath, merchandise exports is something that successive governments have focused on, and this government has laid a lot of emphasis on boosting merchandise exports. But do you think, realistically speaking, India's services exports, software services, excluding software services, can actually match merchandise exports in the foreseeable future?
I think that process is already on. I won't be surprised if services exports equal merchandise exports in the next 4 or 5 years. A lot of the new traction is coming out of global delivery centers or global software services centers of multinationals setting up shops in India, as opposed to outsourcing them to Indian IT services firms. So I think services is certainly a sweet spot, and it comprises of 2 things. One, the faster growth in services, and the second is a lot more constrained environment for merchandise exports. Now, Abhijit mentioned some of the infrastructural issues around India's merchandise exports, but the biggest of them all is neither infrastructure nor necessarily free trade agreements. The biggest issue is a global overcapacity in a range of merchandise products, especially the Chinese overcapacity. So whatever product line you select, product line by product line, China has by far the largest capacity that its own domestic economy can not absorb, not when it's growing now at 2 or 3%. And therefore, for every price line, there is a Chinese exporter who can undercut by 10, 20, 30% without too much of a problem. And that is the biggest constraint to India's merchandise export growth. The flip side, or the positive point of that, is the entire China plus one, or optimization as opposed to redundancy principles in global trade. So India's got that window. But remember, commercial organizations, they deal with it on a quarter by quarter, year by year basis. When costs are under pressure, and the first instinct is to go to the guy who will give you a 10% discount. So therefore, putting both of these together, I won't be surprised if India's services exports touch India's merchandise exports in the next 4 or 5 years.
But do you think India has the price competitiveness in the services sector in a manner similar to the fact that India can actually undercut prices in the way China does for manufactured products?
In services, in a range of services, it's not just about cost, and India is fairly cost competitive and also one of the few countries which can offer scale. Look at competitors, the potential competitors of India in the services space. Philippines. How many people, if you set up a global delivery center, how many people do you think you can hire in a GDC based out of Manila? Or Indonesia or Malaysia, take your pick. So India can offer scale and we are reasonably cost competitive. But more than that, India is in a range of services is actually world class. For example, India's financial services, and Jason mentioned some of the payment infrastructure. If you look at India's financial services, we've been world class for a very long time. The Americans didn't have 100% online trading till very recently. New York Stock Exchange used to have a flow-based trading system till a few years back. Yeah. We introduced that in 1993 or 95 when NSE came on stream. So our financial services are world-class, our technology services are world-class, some of our design services again are world-class. So we are not just cost competitive and scalable, we are also world-class in that area. So we can command a premium.
Yes, sir. Jason, you talked about data, and you talked about the data privacy law and the advantages that it brings about. But there's also a data war, the risks of data war that is building up, and whoever controls data will probably end up controlling global trade. What's your view on that?
I think data is the new oil is something that some have said, and I think that's absolutely true, particularly when we talk about digital services. I think the point about what India has to offer as part of its export economy, services are an enormous part of that, and data makes up an enormous part of that services industry. I'll give you one example of where it's happening better here, and the export of this kind of thing could be beneficial to the Indian economy. If I wanted to apply for a passport in the United States right now, the wait time is 14 weeks. If I want to apply for a passport right now in India, it might take 2 days. And the reason for that is TCS, a great services company, technology company, round of applause for TCS, has developed an infrastructure here, a data infrastructure, a services infrastructure that's more robust, more technologically efficient, and more productive than what the US uses. That's a great example of the kind of service and technology that can be exported around the world very successfully, but it requires the flow of data. And it requires the flow of data across border, which is why we were so pleased that the data protection law enacted last week allows the free flow of data across borders. Because I do think there's this tendency to view the innovation economy as physical on one side and digital on the other. And the examples of where they come together require that flow of data and create enormous opportunity for India. So in the semiconductor arena, for example, India wants to see the construction of semiconductor fabs here. That's happening, and that's very important. But equally important, if not more important to the process, is the design of semiconductors, the innovation that goes into the testing and certification of semiconductors, the research and development of new semiconductor technology. Again, all digital ecosystem services and products and technologies and know-how that require the flow of data and that are going to be important to digital growth.
Final question to all of you, the same question. What is it one thing that you would like India to change to ease the flow of trade and become a more stronger, robust player in the global trade landscape?
More robust internal accountability systems and less of red tape.
Do you think red tape exists even after digitization to an enormous scale?
It does exist even now, and we can do with trimming of flab quite a bit even at this juncture.
Richard, what is one thing that you would like India to change?
I'm going to flip it on its head, actually. I think India is doing all the right things at the moment, and the progress that the government of India has made in terms of its ease of doing business reforms, in terms of its operating environment here, its trade policy, I think is right. And what we need to do is to update people's thinking overseas about the progress that India is making. I've been living here for 18 years, and it's remarkable when I go back to the UK how little people understand the incredible development that's happening in India right now. I'm talking about the amazing roads and the amazing airports and the world-class digital public infrastructure. People don't fully understand how relevant, how important India is and will become, and need to embrace that, I think, and trade's part of it.
Somnath?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we need to embrace, and some of it is happening and some of it is work in progress, is for policymakers to bring in a trader's mindset in striking deals and making policy. The whole of East Asia grew by, one can say, one major decision that, collectively they ended up taking, which is to swap political allegiance for market access in the 1960s. So that was a great trade, and we saw the tiger economies of East Asia, followed by China, benefit enormously from that. India should be doing a lot more of that. Now, the world is a lot more complicated than it was 50 years back, so we need to be a lot more nimble, fleet-footed, and strike deals where they are necessary. If required, strike deals with the devil, and that's fine. As long as it results in greater prosperity for us, for Indians, it doesn't matter how it looks optically.
But do you think decision-making is faster in India compared to before? And do you think, because of the system that exists in India, decision-making can also be a constraint in terms of time?
No, I think in some parts of the policy-making chain, decision-making is certainly a lot faster. Certainly financial services, where I come from, the responsiveness of regulators, of policymakers have gone up significantly. Maybe not true for all parts of the government, but in certain parts we've become a lot more nimble and responsive to feedback and corrections. And we see a great example in terms of how the government is tweaking PLI continuously. They get feedback, they change, they get feedback again, they change again. That's the way to do it. To be absolutely trading oriented, live day to day, month on month, and ensure that every small benefit is accrued to us.
But you're okay with the enforcement of contracts record in India?
See, that I think requires a much larger change in terms of both legal construct as well as legal infrastructure. It's a bit of a shame that bulk of cross-border transactions that happen in India tend to have Singapore as the arbitration center rather than India being an arbitration center. But that will take a much longer time, and somebody should start, but is it the most important thing holding us back? I think there are lower hanging fruits than that.
Jason, what is one thing that you'd like India to change to make it far more efficient than it is now?
I think government of India has really embraced the need to take a whole of government approach to these kind of innovation and technology issues that we've been talking about. There are a lot of different ministries that touch on these issues. This week while I've been here, I've met with the Department of Telecommunications and METI and TRI and DPIIT and other offices, all of which touch on the same kind of issues that we've been talking about to promote innovation. I think a whole of government approach needs to look at regulation and the regulatory regime in a way that reduces barriers to entry for manufacturing. For example, testing and certification of things that are manufactured in India should adopt international standards to make sure that manufacturing in India can produce devices that are exported to the rest of the region. So we need to work on that. So I think embracing a whole of government approach to reduce regulation. Cybersecurity is another area. We have a new cybersecurity director here in India. The Lieutenant General is a wonderful leader and is taking a whole of government approach to cybersecurity regulation. Those kind of things I think are enormously important. So embracing whole of government, looking for opportunities to reduce regulatory barriers to market entry and to export, and recognizing the importance of those global supply chains. Even manufacturing in India requires components and parts to come from outside of India to be assembled here. So we need to recognize those global supply chains as part of that regulatory analysis.
But do you think India is getting there in terms of infrastructure, in terms of factory to port kind of a turnaround time on a global standard?
Yes, I do. I'm optimistic about it, and the conversations that I've had this week, every time I return to India, the conversations get more in depth about the changes that are necessary to the regulatory regime. And a lot of it, if you talk about telecom regulation, the active legislation, there's discussion right now about a new Telecommunications Act. It would replace an act that's called the Telegraph Act. If that tells you how long it's been since the regulations have been updated here in India. Not a lot of manufacturing of telegraph equipment happening today. So I think there are opportunities. I do feel optimistic about it. I think global standards, particularly in manufacturing, can go a long way toward making India a manufacturing hub for the region and for the world.
But why, when do you think, realistically speaking, India can actually occupy a dominant position as a global manufacturing hotspot? Because here we're talking about replacing China or even standing shoulder to shoulder with China. That's not going to be easy, isn't it?
Right. Well, I think there is almost unanimity around the world that finding a replacement for China for manufacturing is an important prerogative, an important priority. I think we're in the process of getting there. There are some things that will be manufactured in China for a very long time, and that's okay. But for those countries like India, like the United States, like the EU, that have recognized that it is a national security prerogative, not just an economic issue, but a national security issue to move manufacturing to countries like India, I think that will go a long way toward encouraging manufacturing to happen here. I think we're getting there. I think we have a lot of work to do, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Abhijit Das, Richard McCallum, Somnath Mukherjee, and Jason Oxman for taking the time out and dropping by to have this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you and the audience.